And that is to establish for us, number one, where they went wrong. And I told you the book of Judges is a sad book because there's a lot of everything went wrong. And number two, establishing for us a pattern in this book of how it is we're supposed to understand what's going to happen. And so it's kind of a nice thing that we're going to be looking at there with a few applications there. Before we get started, Doug, do you mind, would you be willing to lead us in a word of prayer? Thank you.
Let's pray. God, thank you for the day that we have today. We thank you for the rain and the sunshine, knowing that you give us both, that you bless us with them. You bless us with the friendships and brothers and sisters that we have here tonight. We ask that you be with Brian as he leads us in Judges. Help us to gather the information that you would like for us to know and to spread to other people. Lord, we have many people that are been sick and are sick. Please be with them and help comfort them and heal them quickly. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you for that prayer. Get this turned on. Looks like maybe my batteries are dead. Daria, do you know where the batteries are? No. That's an IT answer. That's not my job. Actually, I do have blue. That's a bad. Right. I did find one. Let's see if this will work. Well, this will work. All right. So I do have a battery now. Well, Judges chapter 1 and Judges chapter 2 is where we're at. And if you did the reading for tonight, one of the things you probably wondered about was, wait a second. Chapter 1, after Joshua was dead. Chapter 2, here's Joshua again. We're used to reading books in a chronological way, meaning it moves through things by like the time. So, you know, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Ancient writers didn't do that. And we've seen this before. We saw it in the book of Exodus. You see it in the book of Genesis, that they didn't write from a perspective of things following through in time. And Judges, a couple of the prophets, are very unchronological. They're going to be all over the place in a number of ways and a number of times. So when you look at Judges chapter 1 and verse 1, chapter 2, verse 6, 7, and 8, you get a real sense of we're not really following that order. We're trying to get an idea down, though. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 are going to be setting us up for an idea. I do want to talk a little bit more about when Judges is taking place, because I think that is very helpful. And one of the things that is kind of hard to understand is that Judges and the events in Judges aren't happening one after another. Instead, what's going on is that a lot of these things are going on at one time, that they seem to overlap each other. There's some time periods given to us in the Bible during this time. For example, in Acts chapter 13, Paul says that from the time of Joshua to the time of Samuel, he'll say 450 years, and then he'll knock off 40. So 410 years is about how long the book of Judges covers. In 1 Kings chapter 6, there's a statement that says it's about 480 years from the time of Joshua, or from the time of the Exodus to the building of the temple. So that gives us a little bit of time frame as well. And finally, in Judges chapter 11, there one of the judges is going to say, hey, it's been about 300 years since this happened, since the events in Exodus happened. So it kind of helps us to understand that the book of Judges covers about 400 years. This is what we think. We think the book of Judges is probably around the year 1350 BC. Now if you're, probably 80-90% of you say numbers, I don't want to hear more numbers and things like that. The only reason that it's kind of interesting to know is that there is a hard stop here with David. We do have some pretty good information that puts David around the year 1000 BC. So that's kind of a pretty firm date that we have. And so we can kind of place where this is at and what's going on during this time. I found a real nice timeline that I like, and you look at it and you say, what? That looks very, a lot going on. But what it's trying to tell us is that a lot of the judges happened at the same time. And that this is kind of interesting to me, that the judge probably that all of us know the best, Samson, was probably a judge at the same time that Samuel was a judge. And I actually think that's kind of important. I'll come back to that when we get to Samson, why it actually is a big deal that Samson and Samuel might have been doing the work of a judge around the same time. But it just is kind of, as I said, a little bit complicated for us to picture the idea that these people are doing these things at the same time when we like the idea of a story of one person after another. And that's not really what the book of Judges is all about. So the book of Judges begins in Judges chapter 1 talking about conquest. So God says, here we are in chapter 1 and verse 1, and it says, who's going to be the first one to go against the Canaanites? Now, ask a question from last week. Hopefully you paid attention. What was it that Joshua had done as far as the conquest? Because we mentioned this before. Joshua, the book of Joshua, is about the conquest of Canaan. But here we are in chapter 1 after Joshua's dead saying, well, who's going to go beat him up? So what was it that Joshua had done? If the conquest has to happen still, well, what did Joshua do? What was Joshua's work there? In other words, wasn't that what Joshua was doing all that time? Grant?
I think we talked last week about Joshua. What he did was more about kind of breaking apart the organized nations and the strong cities that were standing against them.
Right. So very good description. We said that Joshua broke everything, you might say. He broke the armies, he broke the kings, he broke the cities. So that basically after Joshua's gone, people should be able to just go in and push people out. Move in and drive them out. So what has happened here is a lot of the people have probably even left these cities, fled these cities, and so a lot of these cities might be vacant. Where I grew up in New Mexico, there were a lot of very ancient native cities there, and they've been abandoned. And I always think it's kind of interesting to envision this idea of going somewhere and the city might be empty, and you could just move in, and that's what's happening with the Israelites. So that was a little bit of what Joshua had accomplished for them. So the very first thing we read is in verse 2 that it says, Judah's going to go up first. God says, I've delivered the land into his hand. Now, verse 3 says, Judah says to Simeon, his brother, come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I'll likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went up with them. I'll pause for a second. By the way, if you're not familiar with this language, this sounds like we're talking about two people, right? In fact, a lot of times that's what we think. Who's this guy Judah? Who's this guy Simeon? What are we actually talking about? Tribes. Yeah, very good. Like I said, if you're used to this, it's not even a question. But a lot of times if you're not used to the way the Bible talks, the Bible likes to personify a nation or a tribe of people like we're just talking to one person. Judah is a whole group of people. Simeon is a whole group of people. And that when they say, hey, brother, let's go do this, they're talking as a group. Let's go down, let's go into the land, and let's conquer this land. I'm going to come back to this because I think something significant just happened. But we find how it is that they'll drive out the kings. It's kind of interesting. Verse 7, you meet a guy named Adonai-Bezek or Adonai-Zedek. It depends what your translation says. And he's the king of Jerusalem. And they're going to overwhelm him. They'll strike it down, and we just read through here. And as I said, I really hope you were able to do this to bring us up to verse 12, where we meet Caleb. Caleb. Who's Caleb again?
Second spy.
Caleb is spy number 2. Who was spy number 1? Joshua. Caleb is spy number 2. Now, by the way, Caleb is the guy. If you could have met somebody in ancient times, Caleb is the guy I would have liked to have met, because I think he's the roundabout. He's the guy that says, hey, give me the hardest land to conquer because I can't wait to do it. That's the kind of guy he is. He just is ready to go. I mean, he's all along ready to go. And now's his chance. Here he is ready to go. And he says, okay, his allotment, Kirjath Sefer, he says, whoever does this, I'll give you my daughter as my wife. So interesting enough, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, his nephew, steps up, and he goes forward and is able to conquer this land. And by the way, it's kind of interesting. His daughter, Caleb's daughter, says, you know what? Give us a little better land. if that's how this is going to work. Give us something that's a little better. So it goes on to describe how they attack, and it describes this land that's given to them and how Othniel wins. And like I said, I hope you were able to read that, because for the sake of time, we won't read it. Now, one of the things to think about here is when God is telling them to do this, did you catch in those first few verses a problem? So verses 1, 2, and 3. Josie, what'd you see?
Well, I kind of got the idea that they were supposed to conquer the land by themselves.
Yeah.
Not adding, all together.
Josie, I'm really glad you caught this. And by the way, this is important. And I think a lot of times people don't catch it right away. People think, God said Judah needs to go. I'll give the land to Judah. And Judah says, okay, I'll get Simeon. And we don't really catch that's bad, because somebody might say, well, God didn't say they couldn't do it. But God did say, Judah, this is your job. This is going to be an important question a little further on. I'm going to push it to the end of class and make an application out of this. But the idea is, here is God saying, Judah, you've got a job to do. Simeon wasn't a part of that conversation. And this is kind of important. Now, by the way, there's kind of an irony to what's going to happen eventually. Simeon's allotment is going to end up right in the middle of Judah. In fact, if you have a map in the back of your Bible, you can flip back there and look at it, and Simeon's right in the middle of that. Ultimately, Simeon just gets swallowed up. So this decision to help Judah doesn't work out well for Simeon. They don't end up independent. They end up kind of swallowed by Judah. And so that's kind of an interesting thing that's going to happen to them. So I really appreciate the fact that Josie catches that here they've made this statement about, I want you to go do this on your own. This is your job. And it seems as though they're not following God's pattern, which is the case of what the rest of this chapter is going to go. And this is the conversation we're going to have. Real quick question. There is mention about Moses' father-in-law through the reading today. Was there something kind of unusual or confusing about that you noticed? Go ahead, George.
Well, one says he's from Midian, and the other one says he's from...
I gotta look at
Canaan.
Yeah. So what do you think of that, George?
Well, I looked at Canaanites, and they go way back. They're mentioned when Abraham is given the promise to inherit the land, that they were the people in the land. But we also see, as we go through time, they're getting friendly with Judah and work well with Judah. Caleb was... No, he was not a Kenite. He was something that sounds similar.
Yeah. Caleb is...
Kenzanite or something?
Yeah, I can't remember. So number one, what are the Kenites not?
Israelites.
They're not Israelites. Yeah, they're not Israelites, but they're getting an inheritance in the land. But again, if you go back into the book of Exodus, you see the Kenites have been traveling with them a long time. Now, number two, what's confusing is that Moses' father-in-law, who's given a couple of different names in the Bible, and so this is a little confusing too, he's not ever called a Kenite before. He's called, you remember what he's called? He was a high priest of, starts with an M. Midian, very good. High priest of Midian. So it's very possible we're not talking about the same father-in-law. We do know in the book of Numbers, it'll talk about how in Numbers chapter 11, how Moses has a wife who is Ethiopian. And so the idea is that perhaps this is who we're talking about there. But ultimately, I suspect it probably is Jethro. But it's interesting that they're going forward with the children of Judah, and they're going to dwell in that area. So it is interesting that you do have some people that aren't Israelites going into the land as well. And I find that kind of interesting. Second half of chapter 1 is a story of failure. A story of failure. It begins at verse 27, and it basically starts like this. It says, Manasseh, verse 27, did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and its villages, or Taanach, or its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor. And as you read down through here, what do you read? You read Benjamin, did not drive out the Jebusites. Manasseh did not take possession. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants. Asher, Naphtali, over and over again. What do you think that looks like when we're reading the rest of chapter 1? What is the image you're supposed to be getting here that they're not driving them out? Josie, what do you think?
They're being lazy.
Okay, Josie says they're being lazy. They're being lazy.
They're not following exactly what God told them to do. They think they're gonna make slaves out of them instead of destroying them. They're thinking, oh, we'll just make slaves out of them instead of killing them all.
You know, Josie, I like your comment there about that because it seems like later on that's how King Saul thinks. Whenever a few hundred years later, he's going to be told to wipe out the Amalekites, and he'll instead take everything from them and say, "Oh, let's just keep the best stuff." A very tempting idea. So you're going in these places. Why else might it be the case they're just not doing this, Doug? What do you think?
I would say that what you were talking about with the two talking, okay, come help me and I'll help you.
Yeah.
Type deal. That sounds like what me and my brother did a lot.
Yeah.
Growing up and work. And I'm not so sure I agree with Josie and being lazy. Is that they're going.
Yeah.
We don't want to do this hard stuff, but we're going to get other people to do it.
Yeah.
And then the other people don't get it done.
All right. Doug, I think you're on to something there, and I'm going to tell you a little story of why this was. Let's go back to the Mayflower. It has nothing to do with the Bible. The Mayflower. The Mayflower people got here. They had a big problem. The governor said, "Okay, everybody, we're going to take this 3 acres of land, and we're all going to work it together." And the first spring, summer, fall, winter came, and you know what happened? Most of them died. They starved to death because they didn't work together. New governor comes along. He says, "Well, that didn't work." So he says, "Here's what's going to happen. Becky, you get that section. And Grant, you get that section. And Al, you get that." And they broke it up into little sections. Guess what? They all grew. Why?
They worked the soil.
Well, they worked the soil.
What they needed to do to get it done.
And what was the, how do I want to say this? What was the motivation, we might say the Mayflower, or maybe the Israelites, that they worked?
Say self-preservation.
Yeah. It's kind of the idea that, when this happened with the Mayflower, everybody's kind of like, well, we got all this work to do, and guess who's going to do it? Well, someone else. Yes. You ever heard that? You ever hear the story of anybody, somebody, nobody, everybody? Somebody has a job, anybody could do it, nobody does it. So it's kind of important to say that God said, hey, I want each tribe to go do it, and you start to see him say, well, that's the case, and I think it's very possible. I think they could have been lazy too. But I think it's very possible what's going on here is they're saying, well, don't worry, because I think the Benjaminites will get this done. Don't worry about it. I think that, and like I said, we've seen that throughout history happen a lot, and I can't help but to wonder, maybe that could be what's going on here. That maybe there's a sense of, well, don't worry about it, because somebody else will get it done, and nobody got it done. Now, I'll pause for a second. Our preacher would take this moment and say, can you see where this might be the church? Where there are jobs to get done? And what do we say? Well, somebody will get it done. And, that might be a problem. So, application point, Grant, go ahead.
Thinking, maybe similarly, all of them are looking at this and thinking, well, one little group of Canaanites that doesn't get destroyed isn't going to be a problem. And if everybody's saying that, then none of the Canaanites.
Now I like that idea a lot. Wendy was kind of throwing this at me too, because she was hitting me with some ideas earlier, and she was saying, she was making an analogy that I don't want to make till later, so don't do it yet. But the idea is that, that this one little thing that you think, oh, that's not going to be a big problem, is going to be a big problem. And so I can't help but think maybe you're right. Maybe there's an element too of, did you get them all out? Yeah, more or less. You talked about you and your brother doing jobs. That's how me and my brother did jobs. Hey, did you guys dig out the ditch? More or less. Which is to say we didn't dig out the ditch. And I wonder if there's that element of, I more or less got them out, but I really didn't get them all out. And this was something that God said, you've got to get them all out. Go ahead, Lamar.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. God's instruction was to drive the people out. And I think God led the people in the land, put up some resistance to see if they were going to really follow through and drive them out. And and they compromised.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they didn't drive them out.
Yeah.
And led to lots of problems later.
Yeah.
But that was part of the issue. It's like us, at least a little bit of resistance and we'll give up. And that's not what God told us.
Nice, nice. And it's interesting to say a little bit of resistance, and we just kind of say, whether it's I don't want to do this, or I'm going to count it done. What I think is interesting is we could pick any of these choices and say, Josie says lazy. It could be lazy. It could be the idea. I really like the idea that it's somebody else will get it done. But it could be this idea of, well, it's not a big deal that it gets done perfectly or we do it the right way. Whatever it is, there's something profoundly applicable to us when we consider this. And it's not a little insignificant detail. This is actually going to be a big deal. Omar, can I ask you to read for us in chapter 2? I want you to read verses 1 through 4. Just 1 through 4.
Judges 2, starting verse 1. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. So it was when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept.
So now the angel of the Lord comes and begins to go through it. By the way, there's not really a comparable moment like this in the Old Testament where you have the angel of the Lord who himself is a person of some debate, but he goes throughout Israel. In other words, it's not just he shows up to one person at one time. There's a prolonged exposure where he's going through the land and he's telling people, hey, three things he says. Number one, what will God never do? I'll never break my covenant. Number two, what happened? What did Israel do? They broke the covenant. Number three, what's the consequence of their breaking the covenant?
They don't get the reward.
God says, I'm not going to do my part. Now, I was reading this again this morning, and it struck me that there's something profound in this moment. God saying, I'll never break my covenant. But you did. So I'm not going to do what I said I would do. There's a popular doctrine today called once saved, always saved, right? And a lot of times when people look at the doctrine of once saved, always saved, they say, our salvation with God, you can never lose it. You can never lose it because God says, and there are passages like this in the New Testament, I'll never break my covenant. I'll always be faithful. Those kinds of statements by God, that I'll never lose you. I'll never forsake you. And somebody says, so we can never lose our salvation. God says, I will never break my covenant, but you did. How does this speak to that idea? How do these few verses, these three ideas, speak to the idea when somebody says, well, you can't lose your salvation? Well, it's probably pretty obvious, but what's the weight of this? What's he saying?
He's probably saying it's conditional.
Yeah.
Things you have to do.
Yeah, so in other words, God's not breaking his covenant when he says, you did, I'm not going to do my part. And if there's ever a pretty profound testimony of you could lose your salvation, here is God saying, you've lost because you didn't keep your end of things. Who did the big work of the things? God did. He brought them out of Egypt. He saved them, preserved them for 40 years. He even says, and we talked about this last week, he was the reason that he drove all the people out. All they had to do was go in and make sure they're all gone. It was a very small thing. They didn't do it. So God says, I'm not going to do what I said I'm going to do.
I think, it carries the metaphor too that this isn't something that God is just dropping on the Israelites. This is a warning that he has been giving them constantly that if you don't do what I say, then I'm not going to hold up the covenant.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That basically this is a big part of the covenant was, I'll be with you in the land, talks about everything, you'll bear fruit, it'll just be great, nobody will ever bother you. He says, that's over. I'm not going to do that, George.
You should have learned that lesson when they send the 12 spies.
Right. They've had plenty of opportunities to learn this lesson, And so it really is heartbreaking that this is happening. Anybody else have a comment to throw at this? Like I said,
I got a question.
Go.
What you're saying about God not doing his part then?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't know exactly how to ask this question because I come out negative.
Do it.
But I will not finish my part. Are you saying that in reality because we didn't do our part, God's not going to do his, but he's still going to do his part with the people that are doing his.
So this is tricky, Doug. This is tricky because this is where so Doug is kind of saying, well, the analogy isn't perfect. He's right, because we're talking about a promise to everybody as opposed to, let's talk about just a promise to Brian. You know, if God makes a promise to Brian, you know, it's going to be dependent on Brian fulfilling his part, you know,
Okay.
to that end. With the nation of Israel, that's a little different because basically it's just, we'll read it real quick. God says, verse 3, therefore I say, I will not drive them out before you. They're going to be thorns in your side. How long were Canaanites a problem in Israel? The answer is
Forever.
to the end of Israel. To the time that Israel is destroyed and taken away into captivity, they're still there. The Canaanites, these people are still there. They're still, and he says they'll be thorns in the side. By the way, that is a hugely important idea that they're going to be there. So he'll never fully drive all those nations out. They'll always cause problems because the Israelites were the ones that were supposed to have done that. Now I think the big application, I'm going to go ahead and break the rule. Let's do it now. I think the big application here is when I put on Christ, and I'm taking this from Wendy, she made this point to me earlier. She said, you know, when you put on Christ, you're supposed to purge your life of worldliness. But let's say you don't, for any of the reasons that we mentioned here. It's, you know, I'm lazy. I don't want to go to the trouble of it. Or I expect somebody else will do it all. That's why I'm in the church. They'll help me clear out my life of these things. Or maybe I mostly did it and I didn't do it all. But what does that little bit of worldliness in my life do to me? It can corrupt me. It becomes a thorn in the flesh. I got to be careful because Paul's not talking about sin when he talks about it. But it becomes the thing that constantly gives me grief. And it could cost me my salvation. It could be the thing that defiles me. You know, in Hebrews 13 or Hebrews 12, he says there's a root of bitterness that can defile a person. Maybe I didn't purge my life of the worldly things in it, and now they're coming back and haunting me. They're defiling me. They're giving me grief. And even if it's not a matter of losing my salvation, maybe they're taking away my joy, my peace, the fruit of the Spirit from my life, because they're things I haven't purged from my life. And that strikes me pretty heavy. Go ahead, Greg.
The whole thing kind of comes down to I've got a better idea. From the first chapter, Simeon and Judah had a better idea than God did. By the time you get down to the end of it, and they can't grind these people out, they gave an excuse with like the iron chariots. They all ended up in the same land, but the original inhabitants were in forced labor. And so, even for us as human beings, about the worst thing you can do is tell somebody they can't do it.
Yeah.
So you're on forced labor, they have their gods, they're going to be there influencing whatever they do. And it comes back to your analogy of putting on Christ, driving out everything, old habits. How is my speech?
Yeah,
what
nice
do
one.
I do
Good one.
on Wednesday night usually?
Yeah.
You know, how is the bowling league going this year that it meets on Saturday and Sunday? You know, little things.
Yeah. What a neat way of describing this idea of, again, I've got a better idea than God. I really love that comment, Greg, because that really is a lot of times what we're thinking. I've got a better idea than God does about how this would work. And, of course, the issue is, you know, from Judah's standpoint, by the way, I would say it seems reasonable. Hey, let's work on this together. You know, that makes a little bit of sense, but it wasn't what God said. And God had said, if you do it my way, I'll help you. I'll help you to get these things done. And so the language here that we're really struck by, and by the way, I'm just careful to say, I think what we're getting in Judges chapter 1 is a look to this idea. I kind of like the way Greg put it, of what we can do it better our way. That's going to be manifested ultimately by them not doing what they were supposed to do. I think that's a pretty profound idea about what it is that we fall into trouble with a lot. I can do it better my way, and we can't. And that's the great dilemma. These are great comments. I'm going to go ahead and we'll move on so we can kind of hit a few more things. Judges chapter 2. As we go on reading here in Judges chapter 2, and again, I'm hoping you're able to read this. You read in verse 7, 8, 9, 10. It talks about the idea of, this is a summary of the book of Judges, by the way. From 7 on, it summarizes it. It says that all the time when they're with Joshua, they do what's right. They do what's right. But then when Joshua dies, it says in verse 10, a new generation rises up, and this new generation doesn't know the Lord or the work that the Lord has done. Who's to blame for that? Interesting enough, maybe it is the generation before for not having brought them to know this. So it's kind of interesting to think about this. It says that verse 11, the children then go out and they begin to worship all the false gods that are around them, Baal, Ashereth. The Lord is angry with them, and he delivers them in the hands of plunderers. He sold them out. Up through verse 15, the end of verse 15, they become distressed. And verse 16 says, and then God would raise up judges who delivered them out of these hands. They wouldn't listen to the judges, verse 17, but they'd go back to the gods, and they'd go back to captivity. And what we're talking about here is a cycle. The book of Judges is well known for being a cycle. It begins when the people forget God. It begins when the people forget God, and they begin to turn to false gods. They begin to worship the gods of the Canaanites or the other nations around them. They begin to do things that way. And then they fall into bad times, and they need the judges to come to deliver them. They call out to God, and God delivers them. Then it starts all over again. And this is one of the things about the book of Judges that's so don't you ever learn-ish. But, there's a saying about history. If you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And if you're in the book of Judges and you don't know the Lord, you're doomed to fall into persecution and need God to send to deliver. I had a question for you about some of the gods that were mentioned here, Baal, Ashereth. Tell me this, what's the significance? Did anybody look this up? What is the significance of the word or the name Baal? What is the significance of Baal, George?
Baal means Lord.
It just means Lord. That's right. Baal is an interesting false god. He's the one that I mentioned to you last week was in many ways considered him and this Baal and Molech were the worst of the worst. By the way, both in the book of Deuteronomy and 1 Corinthians, what are we told are behind these gods? Demons. Very good. And so, these in particular provoked human sacrifices and some pretty graphic and terrible things that they did. But what's interesting is that this name Baal implies the idea that perhaps many people were calling God Baal, and that they would have perhaps found an easy way to slip those names around and confuse these things. And I've often said that perhaps this false god Baal is a counterfeit. We might see that as God. So let's go ahead and come to make some applications in the last 10 minutes here, kind of talk about how these things fit to us. Well, one of the things we talked about last week is we said that when we're considering the book of Judges, we're trying to say that this is a fit parallel to the church. And I said last time, if you looked at Israel as a whole, it's like the universal church, and the tribes are like individual churches, or we might say that they're the congregations. And I think probably most of us understand this idea. We see, we won't turn there, but Romans 11:26 tries to get us to see Israel as a foreshadow of the church, and we talked about this last time. And it's important to say that we might compare the local church then to a group of people who have a specific job to do. So let's make this application. Number one, what is the local church supposed to be doing? So the tribe of Judah was supposed to go to their land allotment and drive out these unbelievers and establish themselves. What is the church in Cornelius supposed to do? What is its job according to God? What do you got, Becky?
Unity.
Unity. Okay, we pursue things that make for peace and unity. I like that. Good. What do we got?
To make sure Christians get to heaven.
All right, so we're working in the most general sense to make people get to heaven. Good. Let's think of some words that even fit to this. What kind of words do we typically say? What's the purpose of the church?
Convert.
Convert. We usually use the word evangelism. We're trying to convert the lost to Jesus. We're supposed to be the light to a sick and dying world. We're the light of Matthew chapter 5. So we're trying, number one, we want to reach out to the lost. We want to reach out to the lost. Now, go back to this idea of unity and helping people get to heaven. What are we doing to keep unity and help people get to heaven? We talked about this last time. We talked about the word edification. What are we doing?
Teaching.
We're teaching. We're building up. So number one, we're teaching the lost. Number two, we're also teaching ourselves because we know that's what helps us to get to heaven. Got some other jobs, though, we're talked about in the New Testament. A little less high-end, a little more practical. Worship. Worship is something that the church is given to do, and there's certain aspects of worship that only the church can do. We talk about what we do on the first day of the week, and that's not something I just do on my own. The Bible, 1 Corinthians 11, says you gather together in one place as the church to do this. So we say worship is something given to the church. Becky?
So we take care of spiritual needs, but also physical needs.
Very good. We use the word benevolence sometimes to describe that, but we take care of the physical needs of who?
The members.
Of the members, of saints, of Christians. So we say we've got, edification, benevolence, evangelism, worship, a couple other things we're supposed to do. Encourage, yeah. We're supposed to encourage each other. I want to bring that back to edification even, because that would be a great subset for edification. How about like when Paul wrote the letter of 1 Timothy, he said this is how the church is supposed to conduct itself. What was a big part of 1 Timothy around chapter 3? Organization. Here's another purpose of the church. We're supposed to be organizing ourselves. What do I mean by that? Following God's instructions, yeah. What do we specifically do? We need elders. What else? We need deacons. What else? We need teachers. What else? We need preachers. Yeah, we have these things. Once we have them, we can quit working on them, right? Wrong. We're supposed to always be working on these things. These are something that this is a purpose of the church. Just like teaching the lost or encouraging us and building us up with teaching or worship, we're supposed to be organizing ourselves. We're supposed to always be working on that. One last thing kind of ties maybe to unity is that we're also supposed to be disciplining ourselves. We're supposed to be watching out for ourselves. If somebody goes astray, what are we supposed to do? Get them back. They won't come back? Well, then we don't like it's the least pleasant part of the discipline of the church, but the church has to exercise discipline. Church has to exercise discipline. I love the idea of the 7 churches in Asia of Revelation 2 and 3 because they really speak to these things, where you can see some of those churches are really good at some of these things, and then some of them aren't. So, for example, it starts off with the church in Ephesus. He says, you're really good about, I'll just summarize it by saying doctrinal purity. He says, you guys are really good at that, but he says, you're not so good about, going to what Michael said, how about encouraging or your first love. Some of the other churches, he says, you guys are really good. You have a good unity, but you allow, he calls her Jezebel. You allow Jezebel in there. He didn't literally mean Jezebel. He meant somebody who was teaching something false. What was God telling them they had to do? They had to take care of this. Something important to think about here is that when you think of these purposes that are given to the church, what if, like the Israelites, getting rid of the people, we do most of them pretty well?
It's still going to be it's still going to influence.
Yeah, what kind of grade do we get? So the church in Ephesus did everything good. Oh, here's one bad thing. What kind of grade they get?
Failure.
They failed. they failed. That's what's interesting about the 7 churches of Asia. Of the 7, 5 of them are told they're failing. And some of them, it's just one thing they're doing wrong and they're doing other things right. But the issue is, it's kind of like saying, I've got this boat and I've patched 6 holes, so 7 holes, I mean, I've patched most of it. What's going to happen? Still going to sink. And so that's what's interesting about the 7 churches. Is like the Israelites, there might be a temptation to say, well, we did most of what we're supposed to do. But in the end, Jesus says, you got to be doing all of it. Now, I'll pause for a second. Just like Israel of old, God doesn't say, I expect you to do it all without my help. We don't always appreciate that, but God says if you do, in fact, he tells the 2 churches that are doing what's right, he says, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to get you through some tough times. I'm going to take you through that. So like the Israelites of old, God was telling them, if you guys just do what I've told you to do, I'll make sure the results happen. It's kind of neat. Paul tells the Corinthians, I plant, Apollos waters, but where does the growth come from? Where does the increase come from? God. If we do things God's way, God says, I'll give you the growth. Sometimes it's like the Israelites where we say, well, I think we can get more if we do it this way. We try to out-reason God. Where does autonomy fit into the story that we read in Judges chapter 1? Judah and Simeon. Autonomy. Well, that's a word. What's that word autonomy mean? Michael, I haven't heard from you yet. I know you've been biting your tongue. What does that word autonomy mean? Independent. We might go so far as to say independent to the degree that we each have our own job to do. Kind of nice in like Galatians chapter 6, Paul says, we each have our own load to bear. Every tribe had its own work to do. Every church has its own work to do. What was the danger back in Judges chapter 1? Well, when these churches said, these tribes said, well, we'll do your job for you. You do our job for us. What happens when one church says, we'll do the work of organization? We'll do you guys don't have elders. We'll do the eldering for you. What's that system called? Yeah, Catholicism would be a great way of putting it. The earliest, in the 2nd and 3rd century, a lot of churches says, you know what, if we just have one elder and he's over a bunch of churches. Yeah, that's really what it is too. Yeah, absolutely. George?
What it is ignoring what God has said and
that's right.
Doing it a better way.
Doing it what we think is a better way. The irony is, like I said, at first it seems like, what did we read in chapter 1? Well, it looks like they conquered right away. They did what they were supposed to do. But the irony is, it left things undone that caused God to say, I'm not going to do my part. What does God say he's going to do for our church? He's going to give us growth. He's going to watch over us. He's going to listen to our prayers. But if we were to say, I think we got some better ways of doing things, let's not do them God's way, God's going to say, hey, I'll keep my covenant with you, but you didn't do your part. So now I'm not going to give you growth. I'm not going to give you strength and peace and unity, the things we crave, because we didn't do our part. Judges 1 and 2 is a remarkable reminder to us that you got to do things God's way. And that you have to do it entirely God's way, or we're going to get in trouble. Wendy, go.
Another thing would be when Judah and Simeon were together, if Simeon had an idea of doing something not right, and Judah was like, oh, I don't know, but then Simeon kept pushing it. So it's kind of the idea with 2 churches or an oversight that one person comes up with this better way, and some people want to push back, and then they stop pushing back.
Yeah. And by the way, we're going to see that exact thing happen in Judges, where some of these tribes are going to do some things, like Benjamin's going to decide to do some things, and the high priest of Israel is going to say, we got to put a stop to this right now, because it'll be everybody soon. And, that's an important idea. One of the reasons why autonomy is such a precious thing is that if this church down the road goes crazy on an idea, we say, well, they went crazy. We don't have to follow that. But as you said, if we had the denominational system, and this is when I talk about denominationalism, this is the system where we're all interconnected and we're all within this. The problem is that a lot of these bad ideas are communicable. They're sicknesses that you can catch. Greg, last comment, and then we're going to wrap up.
On the comment on your growth, you can see churches all around us growing.
Yeah.
But you can go out and look at a fir tree growing too, and it goes up about 20, 30 feet and it splits, and then it keeps growing. It goes up about, and it all looks like it's the same tree. We had cut one down and split like 4 times by the time it got to the top. Each one of those splits rots out and stands a chance of falling away or being dead, basically. And it's the right kind of growth that God will give, a strong growth based in His knowledge, based in His Word.
The right kind of growth. Greg, I love that comment. Greg, you remind me of a story. I'm out of time, but I'm going to tell a story anyway. That's I'm going to prerogative. Go ahead and hit the buzzer and we'll let them know. Preacher's house I used to live in New Mexico, there was 2 apricot trees out front. And, you know, preachers are notoriously bad for taking care of stuff. And I'm definitely on that list too. And when the trees were young, they had staked them and they wired them up. And guess what? Nobody ever did. They never pulled the stake or the wire. So over time, the tree just grew into the stake and grew into the wire. And the tree was always stunted and problematic because nobody did the simple job of, hey, it doesn't need this anymore. We need to take that out. I think the Israelites are about to find out what it's like when you leave a few Canaanites stuck in your side. And, you know, how it is that, you know, I've read stories about Civil War soldiers that they'd get shot. Just a tiny bit of their garment would go into the wound. And that tiny bit of garment would kill them and they became infected. It was always a surprise to me just how small a thing, just leaving a little tiny bit of sin in, you know, or as Paul would say, a little bit of leaven. Leaven's the whole lump. And that's really what the Israelites are going to find out. Thanks for all the great comments and thoughts tonight. Next week, we'll pick up here in chapter 3. We see God's first deliverer come to them. We've already met him, but we'll meet him again. And it's a pretty good story.